we're not doing introductions because it just rather have these guys speaking about this topic rather than which university they went to and what degrees they've got. So we'll kick off straight away with Hakan. The first point that we've got is a nice little history lesson around resisted sprints. So I'm going to hand over to you, Hakan, just to give us a bit of background on resisted sprints, because you've got so much experience, and it'd be great for the listeners to and the viewers to get a bit of an insight into that. So I'm going to hand that over to you, and then we'll dive into the rest of the questions that we've got.
Thanks, Rob. I guess I'm the dinosaur in the room, so I get to start. And then a history lesson, I've been a sprint coach for 35 years plus, and you notice that an elite sprinter, if he improves about 0.5% a year, is great. And if he improves 1%, it's both champagne and cigars. So room for improvement is pretty slim. And I do believe that resisted sprinting can be a great tool, but it isn't the holy grail or a magic bullet for speed. But it has a place. And I'm both happy and honored to be able to share my experience and learn also from George and Jason. So thank you, Rob, for inviting me.
Pleasure.
There is some great research that has been done by George, J.B. Morin, Pedro Jimenez Reyes, Johan Lachter, Roland van den Tilar, Matt Cross, and others. But the focus has been heavily on heavy resisted sprinting and perhaps less on lighter loads and the possible development of the latter part of acceleration and maximum velocity. And as you can see behind, to my wife, I annoyance, I don't know if I have about 6 or 8 meters of books that I accumulated during the years. And it's ranging from Archie Hahn's beautiful sprint manual from 1929. I recommend anyone to read. It's amazing, almost 100 years old, and it's up to date in so many ways. But surprisingly, there is rather limited information on resisted sprinting in all these manuals, all these books about sprinting. Regardless if you're interested in hill sprints or horizontal resisted sprinting or vertical loading, and that's a bit odd, And I've been involved with sprinting since the mid-70s, and I talked to a lot of coaches, and many of them, were active long before me. And resisted sprinting in some form has been a part of most sprinters' training program for a long, long time, and it still is. And I personally have used both horizontal resisted sprinting in various forms for almost my entire career, partly because we don't have any hills or tailwind in the winter, and we train indoors almost 7-8 months of the year, where we live up in Scandinavia. We used to pull tires and sleds and even had training partners on roller skates, behind us. It was fun, but it was a bit dangerous too. We had a couple of pretty nasty falls. And in the late 80s, we used a manual pulley system. I think it was a Swiss system called the Speedy for a while. The problem with that modality was the lack of control of the pulling force. You could use it more for assistance and resistance, but you didn't really know how hard you were pulling or resisting. And that was a real problem. So in the early 90s, when we got a pretty nice hall where we live, we experimented a build like a modality with a falling weight, and we used the gravity, With 4 levers and a 20-meter fall, we could resist or assist the athletes for 80 meters. And if you could add another lever, you could have them sprint almost 100 meters for resistance or assistance. And in the late 90s, because the people wouldn't leave this thing alone, they're pulling the weight and let it fall and crack the concrete, and the superintendent were crazy. So we had an old engineer to design a motorized system with force adjusted by mechanical clutch. And we used it very successfully, both on sprinters and some elite swimmers as well, in the late 90s and beginning of the 2000s. And we measured velocity with a simple rotary encoder from Muscle Lab, but we couldn't really measure force. And Ole Olsen, he's the man behind Muscle Lab. It's a Norwegian system that's been around for almost 30 years. He brought this idea and some other ideas to a Swedish company. And they developed the trainer test, is now called the 1080, But eventually, Ole went ahead and developed Dynaspeed, that is now an integrated part of the already existing muscle system. And in the 90s, we used photocells, and I had big rolls of paper that we rolled out on the track, and we could calculate stride length and frequency apart from velocity. But today, you know, with synchronized sensors and contact grids or IMUs, we can get instant access to both contact time, flight time, stride frequency, stride length, contact length, flight length, and so on, you know, and also vertical and horizontal forces in each step. And in my opinion, these are very, very valuable stride kinematics, both for resisted and assisted sprinting. And this is, I think this is just the beginning of development of sprinting technology. This is not the end, definitely. So we're going to see more and more of this. Prices are going to come down. The range is going to get longer. So, you know, that's a brief introduction on the, you know, on the resisted sprinting that I've been involved with for the last 40 years or so, 45 years. So,
love that.
Like that.
Set the platform perfectly. So I'm going to come to Jason, who I think has just descended into darkness. The lights turned off.
It turns out they're on probably a motion sensor, I would imagine. And so
nice. We're all good.
I know it's just going to happen again. So I guess this is what we've got.
Yeah, no worries, mate. We can still see you, so we're all good. So with that platform that Hakan has created for us, why do resisted sprints in the first place?
Yeah, I think, you know, there's a number of ways that you could probably go with this answer. I think I'll try to kind of narrow it a little bit. And the first one probably seems kind of obvious, but maybe not, but just improve early acceleration. And I think there's some research that shows it improves 10 to 20 meters better than 0 to 10. But let's just say 0 to 20 for most people. That's at least typically where I'll program, somewhere between 0 and 20 meters. But why is that, and why use this tool? I think it really satisfies principles of overload and specificity quite well in a number of ways. You know, I think I like to, especially lately, try to come back to some of these more foundational principles of strength conditioning, speed development, whatever it is, and try not to get so distracted by everything else that's out there. But if we just look at overload and specificity, I think it's a great special strength exercise. You know, and at times when we're going with a really heavy resistance, it's more of a strength exercise than a speed exercise at that point. And then at times vice versa. But it gives us a lot of variables to manipulate between those loads and then the distance that we're covering to start to look at that overload and specificity. And, you know, in an ideal world, we imagine we're getting a little bit more transfer if we're looking at the speed side of things and some of the weight room exercises. It also allows us to focus on a technical emphasis. So two big ones there being push, you know, really using the ground to push out, cover some distance horizontally, as well as just feel different angles of attack and allowing athletes to get into a really aggressive angle, shin angle, torso angle, really all the above, and hold that for a little bit longer to really feel the positioning and the postures involved with acceleration. So between overload and specificity, pushing and the angle of attack, I think it satisfies a lot of requirements that we're looking for with acceleration development. The last one that's really come to light for me over the last 4 weeks is that athletes just, you know, we've started pulling it out with some of the group here, Run Rockets, and they have a lot of fun. And definitely, you know, with kind of high school age that I'm with right now, that goes a long ways, especially when they come after practice and they're beat up and it's hot and it's humid. If we can find ways to have a positive adaptation that they're enjoying and then they're a little bit more motivated for, we get a lot of bang for our buck right there.
Cool. Hakan, you unmuted your mic. Have you got anything to add there?
Yeah, that was a great summary. You know, adding, like you said, so adding, you know, resistance provides opportunity for better body position, you know, better suited to produce horizontal propulsive force, especially in the initial part of our acceleration. You know, but also resistance sprint with various loads, you know, gives also an opportunity to work at different parts of the acceleration. And what part, you know, is, in my view, depending on the magnitude of resistance, you know. really, really heavy, you know, for the first couple of strides. But you can actually, with a certain load, you can maintain the posture. You can maintain the velocity. You can maintain a lot of the things for a certain part of the acceleration curve for longer. So you get more reps in one repetition, so to speak, you know, instead of doing multiple repetitions, you know, we get to practice the first couple of strides. You can do it in one go, you know. You can get 20 almost identical steps, you know, with a heavy load. That I found is beneficial. But also, I think, don't forget the light resisted sprinting with high intensity. It means a lower velocity at maximum velocity phase, but probably a really high neural drive, you know, that might be positive also to, and maybe because of the lower velocity, lowers the risk of hamstring injuries. I'm talking about loads like 5 to 10% of body mass and longer. And I know, you know, quite a few really elite sprinters that have been using that frequently, you know, to avoid injuries and being able to run with a high intensity, even in general preparations, rather than to hit 12 meters per second in November. You know, can run with high intensity, pretty safe with a light resistance.
George, anything to add?
Yeah, partly just to jump on the back of Jason's answer there, and that I think sled sprinting sits on a sort of a special part of the spectrum of specificity, and it can be used as a tool that potentially can provide improvements for both physical output. So, for example, the production of triple extension force, and long-term improvements in application of force as well. There's not too many exercises that have the potential to help the improvement of both of those aspects. Having said that, sled sprinting, of course, resisted sprinting, of course, is just a tool, and it should be used it could be used as part of a more holistic program, just a small piece of the puzzle. And I'm sure what we'll talk about later will regard what it needs to be combined with, that it's no magic bullet at the same time. We shouldn't get too excited about one tool in the toolbox. Finally, I suppose other reasons why you know it's something to be interested in and get excited about is you can use it with large groups. The equipment is relatively cheap, as Hakan was saying. You know, you don't have to use timing gates and sleds. There are many other methods. If you can coach sprinting, or if you're fairly confident coaching sprinting, sled sprinting is very similar to coach. So very similar cues can be used. And I'm looking forward to hearing the two other speakers' views on that. And then in terms of safety and risk, great for young athletes, large groups. It can be done outdoors, pre-training. You know, there'll be coaches on here that don't have gyms, that don't have huge amounts of equipment and have large groups. And it's just an accessible method of resistance training.
Nice, mate. Well, we'll come on to that a little bit later on, but I'm going to stick with you, George, and get you back in on the testing side. So how do we go about establishing high, medium, low initially before going into any sort of programming?
Yeah, absolutely. And hopefully at the end of this little spiel here, I'll give hopefully turn a fairly complex method into something quite simple for the coach that doesn't have speed gates and lots of time and so on. So probably at the lower end of how I'd look at programming for athletes with resisted sprinting would be to provide a percentage body weight or an absolute load to a sled, for example. There's obvious benefits here. You know, they're simple, easy with large groups, quick to get going, and you can progress week on week pretty simply. But massive constraints at the same time. So it doesn't account for individual characteristics. It's unlikely to provide uniform adaptations within that group, so that the adaptation that you're targeting You'll get it from some and not others because of those individual differences in individual characteristics. And also, if you're changing surfaces, you can't use the same loads and expect the same resistance to occur. So that's where testing and using slightly more advanced methods can really come into play. So if you've got speed gates, the one I'd probably recommend would be a velocity decrement. And very simply, let's say we're using Jason 0 to 20, you'd take someone 0 to 20 unresisted speed, find their best time, turn it into an average meters per second, and then you'd use a number of sled loads with that player, and you'd work out what loads correspond to what decrement in their average velocity over 0 to 20 meters. You then find out pretty quickly what is heavy, what is light. We'll talk about what heavy and light sled loads might mean for adaptation later. But that would be my number one easy method if I had speed gates. But one that probably rivals it, and one that I wouldn't need speed gates for, would be an eyeball sled 1RM. So very, very simply, a resisted sprint stops being a resisted sprint when it no longer looks like a sprint due to the load on the sled. So for a given distance, let's say 20 meters again, there will be a point with increasing loads with each of your athletes that technique, form, posture, whatever language you wish to use, or whatever you're observing, it begins to break down. They'll look like they're running through mud. Their arms will start flailing, trying to grab at the air, trying to swim through the track. That for me is the point where the athlete has surpassed a 1RM. No different to the principles of any other movement. So a clean, when it breaks down, it's pretty obvious that the rep is failed. A squat, when someone goes beyond the 1RM or beyond their repetition maximum, it will break down, it will fail. I would see a very simple way of testing for maximum sled load being continuing to increase sled loads with that player. So add 20, add 40, add 60, add 80, add 100. And at some point, that load will create a failed rep. And I see no problem that if you are less of equipment, time, money, that eyeball method is ideal to find your 1RM. And then, hey, we're all S&C coaches. We're all generally brought up on Bomper and Half, Mel Sif. We know our tables of what percentages relate to what types of volumes we can do with an athlete at certain loads and so on. And once you know you're 100%, programming should be fairly simple in my eyes. Jace and Hakan, it'd be interesting to hear your opinions on that, given that probably the technology you've been able to work with over the last few years has been more advanced than just speed gates or just eyeballing. So looking forward to hearing, lads.
I know neither of you have unmuted your mics, but I'd love to get some like George says, some insight from you two who've maybe had a little bit more tech to play with on the testing front. Come to you, Jason. Yeah, come to you, Jason, if you want first.
Yeah, well, I've had the opportunity with that, but have chosen more of, namely with the 1080 sprint, more of kind of that eyeball method, and not, and pretty much kind of the 1RM eyeball method. Also, though, I'd say, with our population at Altus, it was really easy to max out the machine. And in fact, if you're looking at, an optimal power load, most of them would have been over, especially the males at least, their optimal loading would have been above what the machine could provide for them. 50% decrement was happening over 100% body weight ultimately. And so, we spent some time where we were using some stuff out of the research in terms of figuring out what that optimal loading was. But ultimately, for us, it always came back to the eyeball test. And not necessarily, how far are we getting away from sprint kinetics and kinematics, but more of just what does it look like? we know the ground contact times are going to be a lot longer. We know the stride lengths are going to be a lot less. And that's not only okay, but encouraged in a lot of ways. But if things start to get out of control, and that's a bit subjective, and whatever that means to us on that day, that's when we know we've gone too far and we just back it down. But I think similar to what George is saying is it's a very, in my opinion, at least with that environment, it was a very safe approach, because nobody ever got injured over resisted sprinting at those high loads. And I know some people would argue that that's what you should use for rehab, because it slows a lot of the velocities down. And I haven't done that myself, haven't had an opportunity to even decide if that was an approach I wanted to take. But that's, so in a nutshell, I've had the ability to go off the velocity decrements and all these other numbers, but have mostly just relied on passing the eye test, and then maybe cut a session if those velocities start to really drop off from kind of where they leveled out throughout the middle of the session.
Is that similar for you, Hakan, or have you got other options?
I think you always have to connect, kinematics to genetics, and like we've been accumulating a lot of data on sprinters on various capacity, and there's similarities, but it's also differences, but that resistance sprinting naturally causes slower step velocity, that's for sure, It improves long contact times, and shorter flight times is significant, especially with a heavy load. Significantly shorter steps, but mainly due to significantly shorter flight length. The contact length almost remains the same, but you have to watch out. If you see that people work, move odd and don't extend properly, they accelerate with hip flexions. It usually affects the contact length as well. So that's something is good to monitor. And interesting enough, it doesn't differ. Strike frequency doesn't alter so much. It's almost the same, but the balance, the ratio between contact and flight is very much different, though.
Is the testing method, that eyeball 1RM method that both George and Jason have mentioned, is that something that you utilize as well, Hakan?
Well, as a coach, you always use your eyes, of course, but I'm not a testing guy, but I like to measure. I like to see if what I see is correct, if I can verify that with the measurements. I like to do like that. I don't like guesswork anymore, I don't. So I'm really happy with this new technology. It's the most exciting thing that happened in my coaching career. I think it's so much you can do.
George, anything else to add there?
Yeah, just again, it's going to be a theme of what I say is just jumping on the back of smarter people chatting. But the word testing might not be the right one with this. Sometimes we can see a testing session being a waste of a training opportunity and an opportunity to hit a desired stimulus. So I'll just go back to a bit of what both colleagues there were saying. I believe that every training session is a monitoring session for where the 1RM is on that day for that surface. I mean, if you're outside and it's been raining the day before, all of your previous testing data will be, invalid. If you're working especially in team sports and on grass and things like that, even a wet track will have a different coefficient of friction and so on. So, that for the young S&C coach out there who doesn't have time, who only has a 4-week block, a 6-week block, and can't waste time doing testing, just train, set up a training session. And during that training session, play around with different loads, and you'll find the 1RM for that athlete on that day. Use your coaching feel, which something like Jason and Hakan will have excellent coaching feel for their athletes, and their eye will be excellent for their athletes. That the longer you've been working with certain players and athletes, that no doubt the better your eye and feel will be. So yeah, probably more monitoring than testing is maybe a route I should have gone down earlier with my little speech.
Yeah, no, that's all good, mate. Thanks for that. So Jason, just to move things on, And pretty nicely from what George on the programming side. So programming for sprinters, what did that look like for you at Altis, and obviously bringing that over into your current role?
Yeah, so starting with Altis, it was very much, again, sort of what George alluded to, of kind of traditional loading type thoughts around it. So starting with a pretty heavy load, pretty high resistance on the resisted sprinting, and just really focusing on those first 3 to 5 steps. So maybe just 5 meters at a very heavy load, 75 to 100% body weight early in the season. For some athletes, over 100% body weight. And then just gradually bringing that load down and taking that distance out. So bringing that load down really to unresisted and taking that distance out, at least on those sessions. Acceleration sessions for us would go anywhere, sometimes upwards of 50 meters, but that's pretty specific to sprinting, obviously. And that would cover really the nuts and bolts out of a lot of the programming. Would though add in some pyramids, so pyramid loading. And I think we'll probably get into potentiation effects from this type of work later on. But so pyramid loading of just building up to 50, 75% body weight middle of the session, and then work back down towards unresisted or even 10% body weight. The last element that would come into it, so we'd kind of start the year more of a blocked organization, where if we were going to do resisted sprinting on a day and a couple other elements, we do all those resisted sprints and then maybe all those unresisted sprints, whatever it may be. That'd be early on. As we progress through the season, then we start to complex them back and forth. So doing a resisted sprint at say 25% body weight, and then taking the belt off and doing it unresisted, and just alternating. And it doesn't have to be always sprint. Sometimes it could be a plyo or medicine ball work. But first half of the year, kind of linear periodization type approach with it, and then layer in some pyramid schemes and some of the complexes.
Anything to add, Hakan, on there?
Well, I agree on that. I think, heavy resisted sprinting has a place in a sprint program, but you have to be a bit careful, because my experience, it can acutely disturb, developing the maximum velocity. I don't think it fits very well, to do, heavy resisted sprinting and then go out and do maximum normal sprinting. I think that is a route for disaster, perhaps, and a great sprinting, that means perfection of rhythm and a harmonic rise of the body as velocity increases. And I can see how, resisted sprinting might disturb that. And I think, heavy resisted sprinting, it fits very well in a short or long program, or maybe in a sport with less demand on maximum velocity. Maybe harder on a long to short program to fit it in the microcycle. But for us, it means heavy resistance in the running preparation, yes, like Jason said, and gradual lighter as we work ourselves through the acceleration curve during the year. But we also mix loads and normal sprinting in one session, And one of my favorite exercises is a sprint deal with a decrement of resistance with decrement of resistance with distance, for example, 10 kilo at start and 0.5 kilo at 30 meters. So it's a really nice feeling for the sprinter, to have a decrement of the resistance as they accelerate. You can so that's how we load resisted sprinting in a year, very briefly.
Anything to add, George?
Yeah, probably important for any S&C coach to understand the potential long-term adaptations that are specific to the loads that you're using. And again, we can use the same sort of schools of thought that, stuff that should be our bread and butter with regards traditional weightlifting movements, powerlifting movements, that we know that certain contraction velocities and certain loads that we use, relative loads, are going to provide specific adaptations. And so with resisted sprinting, it's probably not too different. We know that with very heavy loads, we have very high requirement for force production, and therefore the specificity is closer to the acceleration phase. So potentially, if acceleration phase is your goal, higher loads may also be maybe your training tool with resisted sprinting. As Hakan was talking about there as well, lighter loads, certainly have their place in your program if your desired adaptation is closer to transition max velocity phases. And then finally, what I'd ask the listener or the viewer to consider is not just to see resisted sprinting as an isolated tool, but what can you combine it with? So there will be a school of thought out there, and a very valid school of thought that if resisted sprint training takes up a very high contribution of your training time, there is the potential, of course, for mechanical changes and potentially, in the eyes of a coach, negative mechanical changes, so negative transfer. But that doesn't mean that we can't overcome that with just some clever programming. So between every rep of heavy resisted sprinting, why not go through some technical work to aid that positive transfer of force application? Some coaches won't enjoy the very long ground contact times during heavy resisted sprinting. It was interesting to hear that Jason has previously encouraged athletes to enjoy and express themselves during the longer ground contact times, but there's no reason why we can't superset or also include fast ground contact time plyometric work, bounding, bunny hopping, drop jumps, so on. There's nothing wrong with, not nothing wrong, but I really would encourage the listeners or viewers to just see this as one training tool, and with the right combinations, you can overcome maybe a lot of the negatives associated with resisted sprint work.
Cool. And anything else to add there, guys? On potential, like George said about using other exercises potentially with the resistance? No? Okay. Okay. That's all good. So periodizing loads across a training block, and we had a message come in that was very specific on that. But it kind of links in. I know we're going to cover these at the end, but like one of you mentioned, I think it might have been George, that coaches may have a specific block, a 6-week block, an 8-week block, with potentially, I don't know, an academy player. How would you program the loads across that specific training block? And I'd put on the message to you all, that was coming to all of you. So does anyone want to tackle that? I suppose it links in with one of the questions that's popped in the chat as well. Jason?
Yeah, I think, really, the reason I was hesitant, because I think it's, unless I'm missing the question, just very related to kind of what I had mentioned. So yep. I would certainly start heavier and then shorter distance, and then just gradually decrease that load and increase that distance. The caveat being, and George kind of touched on it, how does it fit into the bigger picture? And so what is that volume like? And out of all the work that they're doing during this time, are they doing on-field work? So are they getting, unresisted sprints in, albeit in a more chaotic environment or different intensities? I think most often there's going to be some other elements of the program that we'll say, combat any of the potential negative aspects of heavy resisted sprinting. So whether that be change in technique or inhibiting stress shortening cycle, I think it's very rare that we go so far down one of these methods that we'll see the manifestation of some of these negative pieces, if that makes sense. So, for instance, it's probably different with team sport, and that's what I'm kind of working out right now and figuring out in my new role. But with the sprinters, on the acceleration days, we can do a lot of heavy resisted accelerations and not be worried at all about inhibiting stress shortening cycle or changes in technique, because we know that there's 4 other days in the week where they're doing unresisted sprints as part of their warm up, albeit some of them at submaximal intensities. In max velocity sessions, they're still going to go through an acceleration phase oftentimes. And so really that ratio of that really heavy resistance is quite small in comparison to everything that we're doing. So that's kind of the disclaimer, but the programming aspect for me would start with those heavy loads and then gradually just get a little bit more specific.
I should have articulated myself better then. What I meant was in a team sport environment, versus a sprinter when you're looking at maybe a year cycle, but in a team sport environment when you've got specific shorter blocks of, I don't know whether you're going from a 1 game per week schedule to then 2 games per week, and you've got that kind of 6-week window. That's what I was trying to get about. I should articulate myself better there.
No, that's fine. I probably just lost it.
Yeah. So,
I'll give one of the other guys a chance. Then I'll
of course. So Hakan, you unmuted your mic. Got anything to add there?
Just hang on shortly to what Jason said. Both the literature and experience. We have quite a few of publications on heavy resisted sprinting that it really improves initial acceleration, for team sport athletes, soccer players, rugby players, and so on, And it's not surprising, that, heavy resisted sprinting does, put the runners into a favorable position for initial acceleration. And you can sometimes see almost an instant effect, they understand, But is it a transfer to team sports that really ever start from a 3 or 4 point start? They never get into those positions. If you take a football player, they always accelerate from moving position. They are, maybe in American football, a running back can start from something like that, but in most other team sports, So even if you see, improvement when it comes to initial acceleration with the team sport players, and have resisted sprinting, I think the benefit is maybe sometimes questionable.
Anything to add there, George?
Yeah, I'll try and answer the question as specifically as possible, and try and avoid the whole "it depends" thing. I'll try and give you my honest view. If you've got 8 weeks in team sports players, likelihood is that they're not great sprinters by definition of a sprinter. So the chances are that you just need to follow your basic principles of training. And alongside consistency, and that will probably give you the best chance of results. So first one, specificity. Know what loads will target what specific adaptations. So if you have 8 weeks, I would personally try and hammer one specific adaptation from my sled sprint work, because if you're working in football, if you're working in rugby, chances are you won't get to do this twice a week, every week with those players. As is life there. So focus on one adaptation. If you're going for first few step improvement, use a bloody heavy sled and use it a lot. Use it as much as you can. Be consistent. So try and get it in every week. If you can get it in more than once a week, brilliant. If you can get it into a warm up, great. Maybe if you're not permitted to do resisted work twice a week, maybe you can get some banded work, some heavy banded accelerations in there, in their warm up. Be creative. Just because you've chosen sleds in the weight room program doesn't mean that the other forms of resisted sprinting, even if unmeasurable and variable, will not aid you with that consistency and the hammering of that same stimulus. And then overload with progression. So, you might stick a deload week in there with the sled work. Chances are you're probably not doing enough to require it. But again, it's part of a holistic program where you'll have maybe 2 games in a week and you'll have other things going on. So, but generally, that they'll get more familiar with those heavy sled loads. They will look better and better each week, sprinting with heavy loads. And like we've said before, use your coaching eye. If someone's eyeball 1RM has obviously improved and they are more able to sprint with heavier sleds, enjoy the overload. Add another 5, add another 10 kilos, challenge them more, increase the frequency, the intensity of that stimulus. And hopefully if you stick all of those ingredients into a pot, you might come out with half your squad get some sort of improvement. Going back to Hakan's thing, improvement is all about how you measure it. So if you are measuring improvement purely on speed gates, yeah, sled sprints will help. But Hakan's point is absolutely superb. Don't forget all the sprinting, the technical work, finding trunk lean as you step or in evasive work. Think about the transfer to pitch performance as well. Because if all you're using is speed gates, you can't guarantee that that's going to transfer to the pitch.
I'm going to stick with you, George, but I'd like to get the guys' opinion on this as well, especially when it comes to Jason with the larger groups over at the new gig. But dealing with this when it comes to large groups, George, and that's something that you're definitely in your environment. We're not working one-on-one, you're working with multiple athletes. And obviously, you've mentioned equipment a little bit earlier on, but maybe diving into that a little bit more as well, how coaches can navigate both them constraints.
Yeah, so I'll talk about a coach I'm working with now, Luke Woodhouse at Wasps, who runs the strength and power element. Fantastic coach, and the key to this is communication with the rugby coaches. So Luke has created a session where he gets resisted work done in reasonable volumes at decent intensities from an engaged group of players, and he gets it done by only coaching small groups at a time and ensuring it's done in a circuit-based fashion with the skills coaches and skills work. So Luke has created an opportunity for physical development beyond the weight room within the Wasps program by using the skills coaches. Because if you tell the coaches that they can do some skills in a physical block, they'll jump at the chance. So we get resisted work done. We get transferable leg drive, body height type work done with the skills coaches as well. So I suppose the summary of that is try and work with as smaller groups as possible because you'll be able to coach more effectively. We only have a limited amount of equipment as well, and I guess everyone else out there will. Work in pairs, so one can go up, one can go back, or in threes. Yeah, be creative, and yet we don't have to use fancy testing methods in team sports. Use your coaching eye, hammer one stimulus, and I think you'll be fine.
Cool. Anything to add there, Jason, from your experiences, current experience and past?
Yeah, I mean, I'll speak more to the current because in the past it's been pretty easy in that sense, okay. Small groups, and we have all the control in the world. So when we had a high athlete number, we would just put them in groups of 5 or 6 and stagger their start times by half an hour. It might make long days for us out there, but they didn't have school, they didn't have jobs that they had to worry about. So we had a lot of freedom over how we wanted to manipulate that. Totally different story now. And so, a big part of it. So we have at IMG, we have 10 run rockets. And sometimes we'll have groups of 40, 45 athletes at a time out on the field. And so kind of depending on the purpose of the session, we just layer some other elements in. So we'll break the group in half. Half the group might be doing some plyos. And I saw a question come in kind of with the horizontal, vertical nature. So for me, I would just pair something horizontal, like a horizontal plyo or horizontal med ball throw for half of that large group, while the other half was on the resisted sprinting. And then we'd switch. And there may be, it may not be ideal. You may want everybody to start on the resisted sprinting and then go over to the other group, but it's just the way that it goes sometimes. And what I'm starting to see is that it's probably not a big deal. Some of those, I'll call them minor details, at least with this age, they're still getting a positive adaptation. It seems, still working it all out. Maybe I'll have to reassess after the semester and see, but that's been the approach with 10 round rockets, groups of 40 split into two people on a machine. So they get a little rest while their partner goes and go from there. I
think I might have seen on your Instagram or your Twitter, Jason, about using hills as well. Is that something that you've incorporated in there and is there any reason why?
Yeah. Big fan of hill sprints. And part of that is a bigger group, a lot easier to run them through the hill sprints, quite honestly. And we've got some great hills here. Lawrence Seagrave years ago had him put in some really nice tools for us to use on the speed side of things. And so with that one, if it's really just a targeted acceleration session, we go out to the hill and just put them through that. A couple different slopes and different distances there. Kind of the approach to the previous question, and George kind of touched on it. The first few weeks I was here, it was more, don't use the hill, don't use resisted sprinting. Let me just talk to them in a lot of technical sessions, what is sprinting? Because a lot of them don't know and haven't been taught and aren't really aware of the technique. But I've done a lot of talking in my first 3 or 4 weeks here, and I'm sure that they're way more sick of it than I am. So then I go to the hill and I use the run rockets as a way for me to really say a little bit less. And now that it's starting to get hot out here, they're a little bit more motivated on those because, again, they enjoy it. So sort of where some of my thoughts around the program and implementation of that within the team sport has been, at least early on right now.
Cool. Just coming to you, Hakan, some misconceptions around resisted sprints, and a couple of things was alternate mechanics and the mythical 10% decrement that I know you wanted to touch on.
Well, that's something that's been coming up and going, I think no one really knows where the 10% rule comes from, that perhaps the theories about specific exercise must resemble the event to be effective. But what everything else that we do, like tempo running, plyometrics, or even, walking all day long, I think we can forget about that rule, we can definitely use heavy resistance on that.
Cool. And sticking with you, Hakan, as well, potentiation is one thing that came up in some of the questions, and your potential use of resisted sprints for primers.
Yeah, there is a couple of studies. One, I saw one study from Stephen Krause, that that failed to see any activation potentiation, but then there's another study by Jess Jarvis that did. So, but I don't really care. My experience is that a few reps of resisted sprints, can really prime the athlete for acceleration training. It really slowly, slightly slower velocity. It makes things easier to control. And perhaps one can see, resisted sprinting as a drill for acceleration. So we definitely have been using that for many, many years. Prior to normal acceleration work.
Is that something that you do at Wasps, George, or I've done before in rugby?
Yeah, I'd say a problem we potentially had and then tried to overcome was actually a former colleague of mine, Jack Walsh, did a really cool in-house study when he was at Edinburgh Rugby, and what we found was, what Jack found was that 9 to 12 minutes was his favoured time, or was the best time for long-term adaptations when using potentiated heavy to unresisted sprint method. But what do you do with 20 rugby players for 9 to 12 minutes between sets? So he would do 3 really heavy resisted sprints over 10 meters, and then 3 unresisted 20 meter sprints, and he had 12 minutes between there. And we do so that brings up a challenge. That's a turn off for that method. You can get some upper body work in there. You can get some light technical work in there. You try and avoid work that might be detrimental to that potentiation. And ultimately, it's the kind of thing that stopped it being used in the program. The second one is we've had problems in the past, an athlete having a very heavy sled sprint and then going to do their unresisted sprint and almost falling flat on their face. I can see Jason smiling, so I know, Jason, you said you hadn't had an injury from a resisted sprint, but maybe a broken nose or two. I'm not sure. What do you reckon?
If there's going to be one, it's going to be that.
Cool. Is that you finished, George? Are you anything else to add? Oh, good. Oh, good. Perfect. Okay, we've got a couple of minutes left. I will just tackle that. Well, just tackle that first one, really. And is there any special considerations this may fit into your new role at IMG, Jason? Any special considerations for younger athletes when it comes to resisted sprints?
Yeah, I think, and I see the question there, and it's mentions the role of sprint conditioning, and it's probably where most of the approach will be with the hill.
Okay.
Is using, it's debatable though, because what I've found out pretty early on is that a lot of these teams, they think of the sprint hill as, oh shoot, we're going to go out there and it's going to be miserable and we're going to be throwing up. So it's going to take a little bit of time to change that, because that's not what I'm looking for out of the hill. It is sprint and speed still in my mind, and some technical adaptation from that. But I think the approach will be with the LTAD kind of idea of starting with that hill pretty early, and then progressing into the run rockets and the resisted sprinting from there, and then taking it into really more dynamic start positions, more change of direction, more multilateral stuff after that. But I think that there will always be an element of the resisted sprinting with a lot of these groups here, because I'm a big fan of it and I've seen it work really well. And again, they're a big fan of it. And that's everything to me, especially with these young athletes. If they enjoy doing that, especially some of these team sport athletes who are much less inclined to really get after it in the weight room, we're going to use this as a special strength exercise on their high RP days, the days that we really have room to get after them from a speed and strength conditioning side. It'll always fit in there. So it's going to be spotty throughout the AD approach, I think. And it's really just a matter of what is the objective at that time. Is it technical? Is it conditioning? Or is it just a special strength exercise that looks a lot like sprinting?
Hakan, anything to add there from your experience working with athletes on the younger end? Any special considerations?
I don't really have a lot of experience with that.
Okay. Anything to add, George? Nothing there? Nah, perfect. There was one that came up. Yeah, a lot of coaches talk about the importance of, and this might be one for you, Hakan, given what we've talked about before. Coaches talk about the importance of vertical force production associated with max velocity, but rarely mention the similar importance of horizontal force during the acceleration phase. Usual time constraints during training, should you prioritize one over the other?
Well, really, resisted sprinting is really a mean to develop both the magnitude and orientation of horizontal forces. The vertical component gradually gets more and more important as the velocity rises. But I think it's other means and methods of improving that is better than horizontal resistance.
Cool. Okay, I think that's the ones that we can dive into there. I mean, there's a couple around periodization, but I think we've probably covered that. That's probably more specific sprint wise. Okay, I reckon we're done. I reckon we've dived into some of the questions that have come up. So I think we're 2 or 3 minutes short. So I'll let you guys have 2 or 3 minutes extra of your evening. But if anyone's got any quick last minute questions, chuck them in the chat. But thank you very much for your time. Really do appreciate it, Jason, Hakan, and George, for giving up an hour on your Wednesday evening. It's a pleasure to speak to you all again, and I'll let you go. But have a good evening or afternoon for you, Jason. But I appreciate your time. Thank you very much.